and we are in the Gemara before the last Mishnah on the Daf. The Mishnah had said that you can replace a bandage on a wound on Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash, but not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. And the issue with replacing a bandage was because of the ointment, which would smooth out the material of the gauze or the bandage, and that would be considered memareach, smoothing out something which is a part of the 39 malachas of the way leather was made and the smoothing of the leather. And the Brisa had taught that if it didn't completely remove, it didn't completely come off, you can put it back on in its place. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, who had said that if it slipped off partially, you can put it back on, slide it to where it is, and you can even remove part of it, slide it off a little bit in order to clean some of the wound, and then slide it back. Amar Rav Chisda l'shana l'shapir shal gabi kli. The Rav Chisda said this is only true if it never was put down on the ground, but it rather was put on a vessel. But if it was put on the ground, everybody would agree when you put it back on, that's essentially a new bandage because it was on the floor. So that ends the bandage on your hand. Whereas if it's on a vessel, it remains connected in as much as that you can see that that's temporarily put down. He says, I was in front of Rav Ashi, my father. Nafla Avisadia, so his bandage fell off. And he put it back on. Don't you follow the opinion of Rav Chisda, who said that this is only true if it's put down on a vessel, but if it fell onto the ground, essentially that's the end of the original bandage. And even if you put that same bandage back on, it's going to be a new concept of bandage. And Shmuel said that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that it would be prohibited. He said, no, I didn't hear it. What he meant to say is I don't accept that. I didn't hear it, meaning I didn't understand why that would be the halacha. And to me, there's no distinction of whether it was put on the ground or not. Either way, it's going to be either way, it's going to be okay to put it back on as long as you're putting back the old bandage. The next Mishnah deals with a lyre, a musical instrument, a string instrument that was used in the Beis Hamikdash. And in the Beis Hamikdash, there was an accompanying song with the korban, and the accompanying song would have both musical instruments as well as singing. And there's a machlokes in the Gemara whether ikar shira bepeh, whether the main part of the korban of the song that went along with the korban was by singing, or ikar shira bekli, or is the main with a vessel. And either way, there is a mitzvah of the vessel itself, of the music itself, which would make the instrument fixing machshirei mitzvah, something that is necessary for the mitzvah. And if a string snapped on someone's musical string instrument, the obligation would be there to fix it in order to play the music, to do the mitzvah. However, on Shabbos, you cannot fix it because tying the string is going to be a malacha d'oraisa, a Torah prohibition. The the um, the reason it would be a Torah prohibition, as the Gemara is going to tell us, that to just do aniva, to just make a bow, would not make it tight enough, and it wouldn't sound good. And um, uh, uh, and so you have to actually knot it at the top and bottom, and tighten it, and that's going to create the correct sound. And in order to do that, you have to make a strong knot. Now, uh, in regards to kesher, making a knot, we saw that it would have to be a kesher shel kayama, a permanent knot, and it could be also that it would have to be, or either it would be a type of knot that is permanent, meaning a professional's knot. And for whatever reason, over here, this has to be a permanent knot, or Rashi holds that even if it's not a permanent knot, meaning you intend to unknot it and redo it after Shabbos, and you're only doing it temporarily, but if it's the type of knot and the type of instrument that the knots made are permanent, could be that he holds the rice. In any case, Rashi over here is learning that this would be a Torah prohibition, and that's the question we're dealing with. In each one of the previous Mishnayos as well, there's a question whether they would be Torah prohibitions or rabbinic prohibitions as fences. So koshrin nima b'mikdash, you're allowed to tie the musical string on the string instrument in the Beis Hamikdash, and the reason is because you need it for the korban, so you need it for the mitzvah. But you cannot fix a string instrument not in the Beis Hamikdash. And even in the Beis Hamikdash itself, it's only because it broke on Shabbos while playing, so you couldn't really fix it. That's the only time to fix it. Aval betchila. But if you could have done it before Shabbos, because this is a new string you're putting in that could have been done beforehand and you didn't, so then kan v'kanos, it's going to be also even in the Beis Hamikdash. Verminum. So we ask a contradiction. Nimas kino shenifsika, the thread or the string of a kino, of a harp, lyre, whatever musical instrument we're talking about, lo yahaya kaishra, ela einma, he would not tie it because making a knot would be a Torah prohibition. Rather, what he would do is he would do an aniva, a bow. Lakashia harabana Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara at first says that the chiluk is the distinction between the Mishnah and the Brisa is the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, because Rabbi Eliezer said in regards to we saw this in the Gemara in Shabbos in regards to a bris, that if somebody needs to do a bris milah on Shabbos, which bris is docha Shabbos, it does supersede Shabbos. However, if you don't only need to do the bris, but you need to make a knife. So you can chop down wood, Rabbi Eliezer says, to make a fire, to melt metal, to shape a knife in order to do the bris. In other words, not only is the mitzvah itself permissible, but machshire mitzvah, the needs that are prep work for the mitzvah, the preparatory work itself is also going to be, it will also supersede Shabbos. This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And the Chachamim disagrees. So to over here, our Mishnah that says he could make the musical instrument, fix the musical instrument on Shabbos, is going to be the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And the one that says that you cannot, the Brisa, is the opinion of the Chachamim. The Gemara is going to challenge that because Rabbi Eliezer says you could do it even l'chatchila, meaning not only if your knife broke, but even just to make a knife. Whereas in our Mishnah, it says you can only do it if the string broke on Shabbos and you couldn't do it beforehand. So Gemara says it's a Rabbi Eliezer, the Amamachshire mitzvah dechenes Shabbos. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, that says that prep for a mitzvah, not only the mitzvah itself, but even the preparatory work supersede Shabbos. So kosher, that's why you're allowed to tie it on Shabbos, because not only is playing the music in the Beis Hamikdash going to be permissible, which wouldn't be a Torah prohibition in any case. The prohibition of playing music on Shabbos is rabbinic because you may come to fix the musical instrument, whether it's a wind instrument and you're going to come to screw the parts of your clarinet together, or you're going to tune your piano or tune your guitar. So because of the fixing, which would be a Torah prohibition. You can't play music, which is a rabbinic prohibition. But Rabbi Eliezer says even the fixing of the instrument would also be permissible because machshirei mitzvah, the prep for a mitzvah, is also permissible on Shabbos. However, l'Rabbanan, the Amri Eindach, but according to the Rabbanan who say that the prep work for a mitzvah do not supersede Shabbos, therefore they would say over here, Einva, you can only make a bow on the string to fix the harp, but you cannot actually make a knot, which would be a Torah prohibition. One of the last lines of 102b, Kuf Beis Amun Beis, the Gemara says, Il Rabbi Eliezer. Well, if it's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, why did our Mishnah say only if it broke, you can fix it, and not you can make it l'chatchila? Rabbi Eliezer says that you can even go ahead and l'chatchila make it that way. In other words, if you never had a bris knife, you can make a knife on Shabbos in order to make to do a bris. So too over here, even if you never had the strings on the string instrument, you can add them on Shabbos. So rather, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, which discuss whether or not aniva, making a bow on Shabbos, is also going to be a Torah prohibition of knotting, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no distinction. A bow and a knot are going to be exactly the same, and therefore, since we follow the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that machshir mitzvah dochenas Shabbos, not we follow. He's following the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that machshir mitzvah dochenas Shabbos, that even the prep work for a mitzvah, not only the mitzvah itself, but even the prep work would be dochenas Shabbos. And therefore, since making a bow is going to be just as prohibited as making a knot, you may as well make a knot. And because either way they're prohibited, and you need it for the mitzvah, so you could go ahead and do it. The Rabbanan, who say that making a bow is not going to count as a knot, they say, look, you have the opportunity to make a knot. You wouldn't break Shabbos in order to make a knot, because you can do it with a bow. Rabbi Yehuda, well, Rabbi Yehuda, whose opinion is that? You're still going to need the same. You're going to have the same question. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda, in our Mishnah, you're explaining our Mishnah to be Rabbi Yehuda, who says that making a bow and making a knot is exactly the same, so you may as well make a knot. But still, he must be following the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says that not only is the mitzvah itself supersede Shabbos, here would be playing the music, but even the prep for the mitzvah, such as tuning and fixing the strings on the musical instrument, would also supersede Shabbos. So what difference does it make? If it's following Rabbi Eliezer, why in our Mishnah did he make a distinction of whether you fixed it before Shabbos, or could have fixed it before Shabbos or not? Rabbi Eliezer makes no such distinction. Rabbi Yehuda, leave it a man. And now we're on 103a, Kuf Gimel Amid Aleph. Rabbi Eliezer, does he follow Rabbi Eliezer? Well, then, even l'chatchila, even if you never fixed it before Shabbos, it didn't break on Shabbos, you knew that the guitar was broken before Shabbos, the harp had missing a string, but you're allowed to fix it on Shabbos. Rather, the machlokas is based on Rabbi Shimon Rabbanan, and our Mishnah is according to the Rabbanan. The Tanya, as we learn, the Tanya ben Levi, shenifsaka loy nima, a Levi who plays the music, that a string popped on his harp, lyre, guitar, whatever the music string instrument they're playing, bikinor. So koshra is allowed to tie it. And Rabbi Shimon says no, he may not tie it. He must make a bow. And this Bryce over here is clearly saying only if it broke, not if it l'chatchila. So this is the opinion based on Rabbi Eliezer, who says that even machshirei mitzvah, even prep work for a mitzvah, would also supersede Shabbos, but only if you couldn't do it before Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Emer afi ena mishmasas hakol. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says you've got no point in making a bow in on a string in a musical instrument, because the bow is not going to help. It's not going to be taut enough. It's not going to be tight enough to actually make the sound you're looking for. It has to be tight to make a sound. And so if you're just going to make a bow, that's not going to do it. You actually have to make a knot. Ella mishalshel milamata v'korach milamala, or mishalshel milamala v'korach milamata. So the musical instruments that would have string instruments, in order to tune them, they have a knob which tightens the string. So on Shabbos, what Shimon ben Elazar says you do is that you would tighten it, you would bind it on one and tighten the other. And this way, so there was a knob at top and the knob at the bottom to tighten the string. You would bind it around one side, whether the top or the bottom, and twist the other in order to tighten it. And then it would make the sound you need. And that, even though you didn't knot it, that would be permissible to do on Shabbos. And even though that too is essentially fixing the vessel and should be prohibited, but nevertheless, it would be prohibited because he's making a vessel. He's completing the vessel to turn it into usable, which would be a prohibition. Nevertheless, this is better than making a knot. And the Rabbanan say, no, a knot is better. The Ibay say Mahava Rabbanan. And then we could say, really, everybody, all of these are according to the opinion of the Rabbanan, who make a distinction between, disagree with the Rabbi Eliezer. They say Rabbi Eliezer says that machshire mitzvah, prep for a mitzvah is permissible even if you could have done it before Shabbos. And the Rabbanan disagree. And they say only a prep work that could, prep for a mitzvah that cannot be done before Shabbos supersedes Shabbos, because the mitzvah supersedes Shabbos. But if you could have done it before Shabbos, then it would not supersede. And so therefore over here, when it broke on Shabbos, that's when you can actually fix it on Shabbos. And you can't fix it with making a bow, because that wouldn't give you the proper sound. However, there's a distinction. It depends where the sound is, where the string is that broke. If it's at the side, so there you don't need the sound as well, and so therefore you could just make a bow. In the middle, where you need it to be taut and to make a good sound, there a bow won't be sufficient, and so you need to actually make a knot. Or we could say that they're both talking about when it's in the middle. Marasava Gazrina and Marasava Legazrina. Really, it's in the middle, and therefore you really need it for the mitzvah, and you can make a knot. So why does it say that one opinion says you can't fix it, one says you can? Because even though Rabbi Shimon says that you're allowed to fix machshira mitzvah, something that's necessary for the mitzvah, a prep for the mitzvah itself, the tools for the mitzvah itself, you're allowed to do on Shabbos, but that's only if you couldn't do it beforehand, because there's a gzeira, there is a concern that you may do it on the side where it's not necessary to fix it. So therefore therefore you can't do it properly, because some of the strings on the guitar itself are not necessary to fix on Shabbos. And we're afraid that if you fix the middle, you're going to end up fixing the side as well. And therefore, it says that you cannot do it lechatchila on Shabbos, because we're concerned you're going to fix on Shabbos even the parts of the string instrument that are not necessary to do on Shabbos. The next Mishnah deals with another prep for a korban. However, this is with the korban itself, and the daily korban would have to be checked. Every korban would have to be checked to make sure that there are no blemishes on the korban. The blemishes can be all sorts of blemishes, and one of the blemishes that the Torah mentions is the abelas, which is a wart. And if there's a wart on the carbon, it would have to be removed. The Gemara is going to make a distinction between a dry wart or a wet wart, whether one is flaky and really already dead and considered halachically separate from the body, detached, or it's a part of the body because it's fresh and still completely there. Either way, the removal of that wart would be completing or fixing the animal and doing it and separating. It's like shearing if it's a fresh and alive part of the body, so it would be like shearing, which is a Torah prohibition of shearing wool off of an animal, and one of the 39 malachas. So the question is, are you allowed to cut off this wart on Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash or not? And the Gemara is going to make distinctions between a malacha d'oraisa, the Torah way of cutting this off, which would be with the proper surgery, using a utensil, a knife, a scissors, or something like that, or doing it in a backwards way, which would which would not be a Torah prohibition, would still be a rabbinic prohibition. The Mishnah says, "Chodchin yabelas b'mikdash." You're allowed to cut off this a wound, a wart from a carbon in order to make it valid, so that it can be the carbon of the day. In the Beis Hamikdash, you could do that. Medina, but you cannot cut off a wart from an animal, even if you intend to bring it as a carbon. It would seem, we'll see in the Gemara, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, but Medina, out in the country. The imbekli, however, if you use the vessel, even in the Beis Hamikdash, kan here and there, usher, it's going to be usher. Raminu. So we have a contradiction because the Mishnah in Psachim dealing with bringing the carbon Pesach says differently. It's the Gemara says here. The Mishnah says there. Here kiva v'avasei michutz l'tchum, carrying the animal on your shoulder and bringing it from outside of the Techum, which is the area that you're allowed to travel on Shabbos and Yontif, out from outside of the city, and also chatichas yabelta, and cutting off its wart, ein dochen, they would not supersede Shabbos. So if the day before Pesach is Shabbos, and you need to bring your carbon into the into Yerushalayim to be able to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash, so you have your Pesach lamb and it's all ready, but you didn't make it into Yerushalayim before Shabbos, so you want to carry it in on Shabbos and carry it on a public domain, which would be prohibition of carrying, or from outside of the Techum, or you need to cut off a wart because it has a blemish. Those don't supersede Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer says they do supersede Shabbos, as we saw earlier. Rabbi Eliezer says that any machshirei mitzvah, prep work for a mitzvah, supersedes Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer Chad Omar Hava Habalacha. So Rabbi Eliezer, so one answer says that the distinction is both are talking about the Brisa, the Mishnah here and the Mishnah over there by Pesach are both talking about where it's a fresh wart, meaning it's still considered attached to the body. Nevertheless, there's no question from the contradiction. Kan biyad, our Mishnah that says you're allowed to do it is talking about that you're doing it by hand. You're tearing it off. You're not cutting it off. But kan b'kli, and that Mishnah that says that you may not do it on Shabbos is talking about where you're using a vessel which is prohibited. V'chadam, however, the other opinion says no. Hava biyad, that the contradiction is answered differently. Both the Mishnah here and over there by Pesach are both talking about that you're using your hand. V'lo kasha, but still there's no question, habalacha, habiyavesha, that our Mishnah is talking about that it's already dry, so it's considered detached from the body already. So the removal would only be a rabbinic prohibition, and therefore you're allowed to do it on Shabbos. However, over there, it's talking about that it's it's a fresh, it's still moist, still attached to the body, alive, and therefore it's going to be a Torah prohibition to remove it. So Gemara says, so the first opinion that said that the distinction between the Mishnah here and over there by Pesach is whether you're using a vessel or not. Why wouldn't you say this second distinction, that maybe our Mishnah talk about that it's already dry and dead, and over there it's still fresh and a part of the body? So the reason is because he says, well, if it's dry and considered detached from the body, and that would make it a rabbinic prohibition of removing it. It's not a Torah prohibition to remove it. So then you can even use a vessel, because in the Beis HaMikdash, rabbinic prohibitions for a mitzvah would not be prohibited. My time, ifracha, it's already crumbling and therefore considered detached from the body. Well, the second opinion that said that our Mishnah is talking about a dry and already dead wart, whereas the Mishnah Psachim is talking about where it's fresh, and that's why it prohibits removing it. Why didn't you make the distinction between whether it's talking about a vessel and the reason that in Pesach it's prohibited because he's using a vessel? Well, that's because in our Mishnah that distinction is very clearly made. We wouldn't need another Mishnah by Pesach to tell us that prohibition, because our Mishnah clearly said you may not use a vessel. And therefore, must be that the Mishnah by Pesach is talking about even though you're using your hand, still it's going to be prohibited. The idach, and the other opinion responds, Hadik Tani Hasam Mishum the Kabaye Flugi Rabbi Lezer Rabbanan. No, we needed to the Mishnah Pesach had to teach the teaching about Korban Pesach, even though it already makes a distinction between a vessel and by hand. Over here, the reason the Mishnah there needed to teach us this teaching, it's not superfluous, because over there we quote Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you may actually do it. And the reason why it would be important to say it over there is because it's a Korban Pesach, which is a communal korban, meaning an individual. Each person brings their korban, as opposed to the one that is a daily korban in the Beis HaMikdash. So that's actually happening in the Beis HaMikdash. The idach, and the other opinion says, no, you can't tell me that it's talking about a Torah prohibition, which is that the wound, the wart is still fresh and attached to the body, and yet there's going to be a distinction in our Mishnah. You could use it by hand, and over there it's a fresh prohibition. The reason you're not allowed to remove the wart, because it's a fresh wart, it's still attached to the body, and that's why you can't remove it, and it's going to be a Torah prohibition. That can't be, because dumya, it has to be similar to the other two cases. The Mishnah over there says three cases: carrying the animal, bringing it outside the techum, and removing the wart, d'Rabbanan. And the first two are rabbinic. The carrying of the animal is going to be a d'Rabbanan, because carrying an animal on Shabbos is rabbinically prohibited, because we say the concept that Rabbi Nassan taught of chai nosei asatzma, a living thing carries itself. Similarly, the prohibition of 2,000 amma outside of a city, the tchum, is going to be a rabbinic prohibition. The idach, erkiva, the other says no. Actually, the fact that he says the other way around. The fact that it mentions a wart tells me that it's all talking about a Torah prohibition, and the fact that it mentions carrying a live animal must be that this opinion does not follow Rabbi Nassan, and says that even carrying a living thing is going to be a Torah prohibition. To look at Rabbi Nassan, because it doesn't follow the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, who says that a living thing carries itself. No, this brisa clearly holds that carrying an animal would also be a Torah prohibition. And Aviyasa mechutz l'tchum, Rabbi Akiva, and carrying something and bringing something from outside of the techum, which we said is rabbinic. The 2,000 amma, everybody agrees, is a rabbinic limit of travel outside of a city. However, even according to even beyond 2,000 amma, there's a question of whether there's any Torah limit to travel, or that's rabbinic. And Rabbi Akiva says that there is a Torah prohibition, a Torah limit of travel. And Rabbi Akiva, and this is according to Rabbi Akiva that says that there is a Torah limit of travel, and this Mishnah that says that you cannot bring the korban is talking about the Torah limit. In any case, so we have a Mishnah here that says you may not remove you may remove the wart as long as you're not using a vessel, and the Mishnah over there by Pesach that says you may not remove it. And we had multiple explanations so far of what the reason, what the distinction is. Either one is talking about with a vessel, one's talking about without a vessel, and that's why it would be permitted. One says, or one is talking about that it's already dead. Our Mishnah is talking about it's already dead, and therefore removing it would be a derabanan. And whether this is a Torah prohibition in regards to Pesach or not, we have a machlokas as well, whether we say Chai Noses Atzmo, a living thing carries itself, and therefore the Mishnah there is talking about rabbinic prohibitions, or we say no, the Mishnah over there is talking about Torah prohibitions, and they do not follow the opinion of Rabbi Nosson and Rabbi Akiva that carrying a living thing would still be a Torah prohibition, and travel outside of the city would also have a Torah limit and a Torah prohibition. Masav Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef asked, Amar Rabbi Eliezer Kavachomer. Rabbi Eliezer says that we should have a Kavachomer should have be able to prove that this is permissible on a Kavachomer, a logical argument based on what is a stricter halacha. Shechting an animal is going to be a Torah prohibition. You're not allowed to kill a live thing on Shabbos, and so shechita is prohibited. And yet, dochas Shabbos, yet the mitzvah of shechting, which is an obligation on Shabbos, whether the daily korban or the korban Pesach that happens to be on Shabbos, that supersedes Shabbos. These, which are only rabbinic, for sure they should supersede Shabbos. So you see clearly over there, Rabbi Elazar is saying that it is a rabbinic prohibition, not a Torah prohibition. Ela Amar Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef says we can't say the distinction that we said before. Rather than hava haba yad. Of course, we're going to have to be talking about that both our Mishnah in here and the Mishnah in regards to Pesach are both talking about that he's not using an instrument to remove the wart, but rather he's using his hand. However, ushvus b'mikdash, even though that both in regards to a korban, which would be for which you should be allowed to do a rabbinic prohibition because you have a mitzvah to do that. However, he makes a new distinction that we haven't had yet. That when you're in the Beis Hamikdash, and because you're doing a mitzvah, a rabbinic prohibition is going to be permissible. However, even for a korban, if you're doing it outside at home, not in the Beis Hamikdash itself, then you cannot do even a rabbinic prohibition. There would be no heter, no permission to transgress the rabbinic prohibition, even for a korban, if you're doing it at home. And so the daily korban, which our Mishnah is talking about, that's done in the Beis Hamikdash. However, the korban Pesach, that's something that you would do at home. You would check your korban, and then only after it's been checked and you know for sure that it's all good, you're going to bring it to the Beis Hamikdash. So that check and the removal of the wart would happen at home, and even a rabbinic prohibition may not be done. Only in the Beis Hamikdash itself would a korban obligation permit the transgression of a rabbinic prohibition. Shvus the mikdash b'medina. However, even for a korban, a rabbinic prohibition done at home, lo yetiru, would not be permissible. Yosef Abaye kamal ala shmaita. So Abaye repeated this teaching. Esaver of Safra Labai. So Rav Safra challenged that. Hayakara b'sefer ala eskufa. We saw earlier that if somebody is reading a scroll, a Torah scroll, or a Tehillim scroll, one of the Kisvei Kodesh, on a scroll, and one side of the scroll rolls off of the eskufa, off of the stoop in front of the house, into a public domain. When his galgal asefim miyada, Goyle Etzla, he can roll it back to him. Now, Va'achad Shvus the Mikdash. There, it's similar to a mitzvah concept, just like a korban. It's the honor and the dignity of the Sefer Torah. So it's considered a mitzvah thing, and it's a Torah prohibition. It's a rabbinic prohibition, as we said over there, that it's a carmelis. The stoop itself is not a reshus hayachid, a private domain, but a carmelis. And nevertheless, when we said that there's going to be a rabbinic prohibition of carrying or pulling it back from the street back into your possession, and the halacha says that even though it's not in the Beis Hamikdash, even though it's at home, you're allowed to do it. And yet the rabbinic prohibition of, you can't bring it back because maybe it'll all fall out of your hand. You're going to go and get it, which is the reason for the rabbinic prohibition, and nevertheless, you're allowed to pull it back. So the Gemara says, so he says, no, since we explained over there that it's talking about a rabbinic domain stoop, not a real oraisa private domain or a shus hayachid, but rather a carmelis, and he's also holding on to the one side, so it never really left his hand. So that is actually permissible, even if it wasn't a Sefer Kodesh. It's just permissible, really, because there is no rabbinic prohibition at all. You're in a rabbinic domain, meaning on a Torah level, this isn't a prohibited domain in any case. And you're still holding on to one side, so it's not really out of your hand, therefore you're allowed to roll it back. And that's not, but however, in our question of removing a wart, which is a rabbinic prohibition, even in a rabbinic form is going to be prohibited since it's not in the Beis Hamikdash itself. So we ask another question. You're allowed to lower the carbon pesach. They would roast the carbon pesach on a spit, on a stick. Basically, they would impale the carbon and roast it, and they would have to lower it into the oven or into the fire pit in order to roast it. And we say, in regards to cooking something on Shabbos, it would have to be cooked way before Shabbos and ready. Otherwise, we're concerned if you leave something on the in the oven on Shabbos and it's not fully cooked, you may come to increase the heat by fanning the flames or turning the coals in order to increase the heat so that it cooks quicker and becomes complete on Shabbos. That's a rabbinic prohibition of putting something on the fire too close to Shabbos where it's not going to be ready, on account of that maybe you're going to increase the heat. But yet, in regards to Korban Pesach, it says even right before Shabbos, you can lower it into the oven and allow it to continue roasting into the night, and we're not concerned that you're going to fan the flames. The Mikdash b'Medina. This is a mitzvah, of cooking, of roasting the animal, because that's the way you have to eat the Korban Pesach. But you're not doing it in the Beis Hamikdash. You're doing it outside at home. And nevertheless, you're allowed to do and nevertheless, the rabbinic prohibition does not apply. So you see that the rabbinic prohibition does not apply even not in the Beis Hamikdash. Even at home, since you have a mitzvah to do of a korban, the rabbinic prohibitions don't apply. Ishtik. So he was silent. He also commented of Yosef, Amalei Hachi Amalei Rav Safra. So Rav Yosef said, this is what Rav Safra taught me in defense of Rav Safra's explanation. Amalei, so he said to him, this is what Rav Safra, Abaye said, this is what Rav Safra challenged me. Amalei, why didn't you respond to him? The reason is, the reason is, people preparing a Korban Pesach are called, every group is called the Chabura. People that are preparing Korban Pesach are very diligent to make sure that they do everything right. And therefore, we know they won't fan the flames because they understand they're there to protect each other and to tell each other, no, don't do that because it's Shabbos. So they're diligent to do the mitzvah in the proper way. Abaye didn't respond that because it's true. We have such a concept, but only in the Beis Hamikdash, the Kahanim who are trained, we say they are diligent and will make sure not to transgress. Kahanim zrizim heim amrina. That we do say. Now, B'nai Chabura is the reason named Amrina. But we don't say that every group of people that's coming together for a Korban Pesach knows all the laws and they will be able to be diligent to not break Shabbos when preparing the roasting of the korban. We don't say that, and therefore there should be a rabbinic prohibition of roasting too close to Shabbos because you may end up fanning the flames on Shabbos. And since we don't say that, you see that indeed a rabbinic prohibition does not apply for a korban even at home. Rava Amar, Rava has a different interpretation. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And really, our Mishnah and the Mishnah Korban Pesach are both talking about removing the wart by hand. And there would be no permission to use a vessel because that would be a Torah prohibition. And they're both talking about a fresh wart that's still considered attached to the body, and therefore there would be a prohibition. And the question is this something that could have been done before Shabbos? And you didn't, and therefore you can't do it. The Amar, and this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who says, Machshira mitzvah dechenes Shabbos. That says that a Torah prohibition, that a prep work for a mitzvah also would be permissible on Shabbos. However, Moeder Rabbi Eliezer, the Kama de Efshel Shanui Meshanina. However, as much as you can do, as much as you can do not to transgress the Torah prohibition, you have to do. Now we go to Kuf Gimel Amid Beis, 103b. Maihi, where do we see this? The Tani we learned. Kohen also leyabelas. A Kohen who needs to do the avodah, who needs to do the service in the Beis Hamikdash, and he himself got a wart. So he himself may not tear it off. A friend, and that would be a blemish, so you couldn't do the service. So a friend can tear it off, but he cannot. And a friend can do it only with his teeth. Yuck. However, right, this is not something you want to have to do for a friend. In any case, b'shinav in b'klila, you can do it with his teeth, but not with a vessel. And chavera in iula, and he can't do it for himself. Somebody else would have to do it for him. So you see that as many distinctions from the normal way of doing it, and need to be done, even though that it's allowed to be done on Shabbos. So Gemara says, Mani, whose opinion is this? Ilay Rabbanan. Is it the opinion of Rabbanan of a Mikdash? And we'll talk about in the Beis Hamikdash. Kivinam Rabbanan ba'alma mishum shvus hachamali hu mali chavera. Since generally we say this is a rabbinic prohibition of removing this wart, so who cares whether he does it himself or his friend, whether he does it with his teeth or not? Elalav Rabbi Eliezer, must be this opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, Dama ba'alma chayv chatas, who says that the removal of a wart is really a Torah prohibition. And nevertheless, and even though he says that this would be considered a removal, the removal would be a Torah prohibition, nevertheless, he says you're allowed to do it because you need it for the mitzvah. However, whatever you can do to limit the prohibition, you need to do. So Gemara says, no. I can tell you the removal of this wart of a kohen is talking about the Rabbana. And indeed, he also let Bekresa if it was on a place that he himself could remove it, so then he would remove it himself. Where this wart came on his shoulder or his back, where he can't move it himself. He can't remove it himself. Or on his underarm, anywhere where he can't remove it on his own. He cannot remove it. And that's why a friend is doing it. But of course, if he can do it himself, he's allowed to do it himself. So why does a friend have to remove it with his teeth? He can remove it by hand. And therefore, we would say it's Rabbi Eliezer. The Amar Rabbi Eliezer machlekas biyad, avo bekli devra kol chayiv. The machlekas is only by hand, but by a vessel, everybody says you're not allowed to remove it. Utamech. So Gemara says that too doesn't make sense. Rabbi Eliezer nami lishkali nili biyad. Well, according to Rabbi Eliezer, why do you need teeth? Let him take it by hand. Haima. So Gemara says no. The reason is Iyamis b'shlama Rabbi Eliezer. That according to Rabbi Eliezer makes sense that we obligate him that machshira mitzvah. He's allowed to even transgress a Torah prohibition, but whatever he can do to change it is going to have to make it less of a prohibition. So he's going to change it from a Torah prohibition to a rabbinic prohibition. So therefore, also whatever less prohibition he can do, even within the rabbinic prohibition, to make it less, we're going to do. So Haina the Gaza Yad Atu Kli, he says, no, don't use even your hand, because if you use your hand, you may come to use a vessel. Eli Amis Rabbanan. However, if you say it's the Rabbanan who are not concerned with this, and they don't say that whatever you can do to make it less of a prohibition you should do. So Nishkalei Biyad. So let him take it away by hand. And since we didn't say that, clearly this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and that's an explanation of our Mishnah and the Mishnah of Pesachim as well, that the distinction is, according to Rabbi Eliezer, whatever you can do to limit the prohibition is what you need to do, Masula Midi, and there's nothing to respond to that. Have a great shot.